It's easy to not think too much about how we get around. Sure, we spend a lot of time figuring out what is the fastest way I can get to work and how do I need to get to the grocery store. But once we find a route to the locations we frequent, we often get set in a pattern. I take this train, I drive this way, I walk these blocks. In Houston, as in much of the United States, the default mode for most people is driving. The city, like most built largely in the mid century on, is built for the car. But young people, both in Houston and around the country, are increasingly disillusioned with the car. High purchase and maintenance prices, alongside experiences with multimodal transit, means there's now a sustained political movement at both the local level and all the way up to the national level for more forms of transit than just automobiles. From bike lanes to planned rail lines, these new visions of what it means to be an urbanite are changing how we think about and live in our cities. On today's show, we're talking about the many ways people travel, which are best for the climate, for our health, and how some of that change is being advocated for right here in Houston. I'm Weston Twardowski, an instructor in and the Associate Director of Rice University's Center for Environmental Studies, and Associate Director of Eco Studio in Rice's Sustainability Institute, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder, you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Today I'm joined by Dr. Casey Williams, who is sitting down to speak with me alongside Alex Spike and Alondra Torres, who are the founders of a group focused on walkability in Houston. Friends of the Boulevard is the name of the group, correct?
That is correct.
Great. Can you tell us a little about Friends of the Boulevard?
Yeah, so Friends of the Boulevard came together shortly after Mayor Whitmire put the Montrose Boulevard project on pause. And we came together because we wanted to highlight the diverse voices that were backing this project. So for me specifically, I'm a Mexican-American woman. I experience a lot of harassment from drivers. So we wanted to bring more women of color into the space. We also wanted to highlight those with disabilities who really, really need this project. And
renters especially.
Renters, yes.
A lot of roadway projects utterly exclude those who don't own property. And that's a terrible shame because Montrose is nearly 2/3 renters. So we're talking about a mass disenfranchisement or disorganization, lacking a voice.
I think that's, something that probably resonates with the two folks talking to you right now, as Casey and I have both lived in Montrose at various points over the last few years. I no longer do, but have, experienced some of what you're discussing firsthand.
Yeah, I imagine that there's quite a bit of support for the kinds of projects that you're endorsing that have been proposed, but also things that you envision for the future that are even more robust than some of the projects that have been proposed. What is the process of talking to residents in Montrose been like? What sorts of response have you gotten from folks? What does the support look like on the ground?
I think that there is broad community support for improving walkability, bikeability, and improving Metro in Montrose. We had every single civic association sign on to things like the University line both times. The Montrose Boulevard project has the support of the super neighborhood and every single civic association along it. But besides that, we kind of vote with our feet. Montrose has twice as many people that commute by bicycle than the rest of the city. We have some bicycle infrastructure. We have a reputation of being one of the most walkable neighborhoods in town, and that's well earned. We're a younger neighborhood. I think that's the cocktail of constituents that builds for a really great sort of community backing for big mobility projects.
Well, and it's something you see in younger communities in general, is that drive and desire both for walkable places, for kind of mixed-use places where you can experience a lot of things, but also very much places where maybe you don't have to have a car because cars have gotten very expensive for
Yeah.
folks who haven't maybe been paying attention the last few years. And I mean, that's also, to be frank, I mean, part of the reason when I first moved to Houston, I did not have a car. And the area that I was living in, I picked explicitly because I thought that was one of the areas that I could realistically get by without a car. I now have one. My life is now different in Houston. I live in a different area. But when I was living and thinking about the realities of how do I get to work and not have a multi-hour commute to do so, my options were kind of downtown, midtown, or Montrose.
Yeah, so it's National Pedestrian Safety Month in October, and I wanted to highlight that because it really is about celebrating like what it means to be a pedestrian, and I think that is very different for different cities in the US. I mean, you ask someone in Houston, they'll probably say it's fearful or um, you can't get anywhere without driving, everything's 20 minutes away. But you ask someone from New York and they're like, I never learned how to drive. I don't have a license. Like, what do you want from me? Um, but for me specifically, it means I think it's a form of protest. And again, like I mentioned, I am like a woman of color, also like, you know, petite. So drivers like to share lanes with me or they like to honk. I mean, just on our way here, we were on Main and Cambridge and two trucks turning right almost slammed into us on a campus.
And we had the
So,
signal.
Yeah, we had the signal on campus. So through this process, we've talked to so many different people. We've also, I mean, there are 6 schools zoned in Montrose, in the Montrose area, and we've talked to those families, and if you live within 2 miles of the school, you don't get bus service, and now that's 3 miles. So that metric has changed, but our infrastructure hasn't. So I always think about like what happens when the road floods. And usually during a disaster, when there's flooding, bike ridership increases as well. So there's a need for that infrastructure, and people will use it regardless of what the condition is. And through this process, Mayor Whitmire pausing the project, we've brought so many people to City Council, we've brought people to the TERS board meetings, and we've actually had completely new people who have never spoken at either of those meetings, who have never attended those meetings, show up. And even with the walking audit too, throwing in a little bit of citizen science, I think my priority is bringing this process to the regular person so they can have the ability, vocabulary to articulate what their vision is for Houston.
Well, I gotta add on to that. What's I think is so special about what we've seen is the West Gray Multi-Services Center is right there. And there's a disability advocacy group that's based out of there, and they literally cannot get out of the facility oftentimes. KPRC covered the sidewalks being so poor that the group could not go to, say, Mercantile or go to, what's the coffee place that just closed?
Canary.
Canary Coffee.
R.I.P. Canary.
The parents are trying to cross Montrose Boulevard in West Clay, and they literally can't do it. The cars don't follow the rules. They're not yielding to folks on foot.
It's also just a terrible intersection to try to cross, having done it before.
Oh my goodness.
You mentioned a project, and so I mean, I think that's really what we're chatting about, and the impetus for a lot of your work. What is this Montrose redevelopment project that you're getting at?
Yes. So the Montrose Boulevard Improvement Plan has been in the works for something like 5 to 10 years now. It's been on the long-range plans of the Community Redevelopment Board for that long. It's been informed by the Walk and Bike Montrose study and years and years and years of community input. If y'all are maybe just a little bit more context for everybody, but Montrose Boulevard is on the high injury network. As we mentioned earlier, there are 6 schools zoned in the area. Average driving speeds have increased over the years despite the traffic numbers going down. And fatality and danger of driving increases, or during a collision increases with speed. And if there's less cars on the road, folks are able to go faster. So we have a cocktail of we have a really toxic cocktail of conditions that make the boulevard especially dangerous. The project, with input from the parents fighting for safe streets and folks looking to ride a bike in the neighborhood includes things like a shared use path, so like a bike lane behind the curb rather than in the street. It includes safe crossings at places like West Clay, like we talked about. It includes a whole new drainage system under the roadway so that water can get out of the neighborhood streets under the get out of the neighborhood streets under the boulevard and shipped out to the bayou as commanded by the Harris County Flood District. And it includes a new pedestrian bridge over Allen Parkway so that it's a little easier to get to Buffalo Bayou. What excites me most is that shared use path. With that, we have a almost entirely separated ride directly from Montrose to downtown using Buffalo Bayou and the new bicycle infrastructure. That's transformative.
I think what's important to note about this project is the history of it. So it did start off as a flood mitigation project, and through public input evolved into what is now the shared use path, and a project that really, I think, is a great example of spatial planning in Houston, which I think is absent. Sometimes when it starts off as a flood mitigation project, they'll decide to repave the road instead of building additional amenities. And for Montrose, that's really exciting because we also have a ton of businesses looking to fill those empty lots. So this is an opportunity not only to have like more mobility amenities, but also to have a revitalization of our boulevard, of our economy, to clean up the air. Air quality, of course, is a huge issue in Houston. All around, just a really great project.
There are so many empty plots of land on Montrose
We've lost
Boulevard.
so many grocery stores.
The Disco Kroger, the half-price books.
The half-price books hurts me.
These are opportunity sites, places where new things can come in, right? And there's a big condo tower planned for Westheimer and Montrose. There's a new mid-rise apartment building planned for the Kroger spot. Everybody's just sort of waiting for the project to get started. No one wants to do construction while the road is under construction too. So there's sort of this like, I don't know, what's the word? Anticipation or maybe like a truce, like everybody's waiting for something to move, for someone else to make the move.
It's worth saying too that these predictions you have aren't just speculation. There's lots of research from the Urban Institute and elsewhere that indicates that improving walkability, adding protected bike lanes, shared use paths, and things like this not only decrease pedestrian injuries and fatalities, but also increase the economy in a place as you have more people moving by businesses. The people who stop into those businesses increases, and you're able to sustain local companies more easily and for longer. I wonder if it's worth addressing some of the objections to the project. And as I understand it, there are two, at least. One has to do with the plan to remove some of the trees in the area. And then the other has to do with concern that decreasing the width of the traffic lanes will slow people down and increase congestion.
So so I think to add a little bit more clarification, not a single oak tree from the median of the road is to be removed. Every single one has an individualized protection plan, and each tree that is going to be removed on the barrier, the space between the curb and the sidewalk in that green space, is to be replaced nearly 2-to-1. On my half of the boulevard, coverage is pretty sparse, and I'm really looking forward to more canopy, sort of like making it a little bit more even across the entire length of the project. I think that concerning traffic lane widths, I see that as one of the most important components to this project. We know for a fact, thanks to the Federal Highway Administration and the National Association of City Transportation Officials, that the wider the lane, the faster traffic goes, and thus the more lethal collisions are. One of the single most important thing we can do, and maybe this is one of the more important issues of urban places, of cities in general, is livability and slowing cars down. And that doesn't necessarily have to come at expense of capacity or throughput of vehicles. That hasn't been the case in other so-called road diets. Though, to be clear, there's no actual reduction in the number of lanes on Montrose Boulevard.
I think something, especially as we are an environmental show, we want to bring this, sometimes I think folks wonder why we often delve into urban design on the program. And partially that's is exactly as Alondra was saying earlier, more cars we can get off the road, less air pollution they're putting out, the less space we're dedicating to the roads, the more space we can dedicate to greenery, to walkable areas, to all of these things that sometimes sound like they're about human concern, sometimes are very explicitly about how do we cope with the realities of urban heat. The more trees we can put up places, as you're pointing out, if we can increase that tree canopy, that's actually a big win for a lot of the kind of environmental hazards that we deal with as a city. And part of that is, I think folks, especially in Houston, often get scared at the suggestion of, we're going to have fewer cars on the street. The reality is we are at a point where we all like to complain about traffic. I mean, find me a Houstonian who one of their favorite occupations is not complaining about the traffic. And I don't know, I guess I'll show you $5 because it seems to be the pastime of the city. The point being, adding more cars in no circumstances reduces our traffic. Creating walkable neighborhoods, creating zones where we don't have to have a car so that those of us who want to willingly live in areas where it is less car reliant doesn't actually impact people from outside, but does make that zone far more livable for those there, reduces cars, reduces the noise pollution associated with cars, reduces the air pollution associated with cars, and is a much safer environment, to your point, for pedestrians, and allows us to do really cool things. The fact that this grew out of a flood mitigation strategy, right? The fact that it can actually allow us to reinforce those infrastructural settings that allow us to exist here and be safer from flooding, from pollution of various kinds, is really critical progress. And the reality is, as much as Houston loves to think we're in a place of infinite space, there is no such thing actually as infinite space, and we have to be very strategic about how we use the space we have.
We should emphasize too that this is an environmental justice issue, and I know this is something that you've talked a lot about. Tree cover is not evenly distributed throughout the city. The road fatalities, pedestrian fatalities are not evenly distributed. Right? There's the injustices, the social injustices that we see in the city are also reflected in terms of who's exposed to environmental hazards and hazards on the streets. So I know that's an important part of your project also.
I think y'all hit it right on the head. Like my background, I'm an air scientist. I've very specifically studied air pollution and climate science. And 50% of all of our carbon emissions are transportation in Houston. We simply have to provide more options to get around so that people can choose to not drive. I think that this all comes down to values, Are we concerned about safety and equity? Are we concerned about transportation options and comfort for everybody of all abilities, of all ages? Or are we singularly concerned with making it as, I want to say, comfortable and speedy to drive, but even that's not the case. The more comfortable and the more speedy you make it to drive fast, the more cars you add to the road, and then you get back in the same position you started in.
This is Casey was talking a little earlier with me about induced demand. Do you want to talk at all about that and what you were, yeah.
Well, there's just a huge amount of research. I know that you know of it that suggests that widening traffic lanes and adding traffic lanes to roads and highways does not actually reduce congestion. In fact, it does the opposite, as it induces people to drive for a number of reasons, but the research is quite clear on this. And so, as you're saying, it's an important point. You might think that adding a traffic lane would make traffic lighter, make congestion less, but actually it does the opposite. It's not even solving the problem it intends to solve.
And that's what's, I think, most challenging about roadway projects and challenging things like, I'm going to say highway expansion, is that it's not necessarily intuitive. Like you said, you add a lane, there's more space for cars, so there should be less congestion, right? But that's obviously not the case. That's been proven hundreds of times now across the entire country. And that's why I think it's so important about things like Friends of the Boulevard and what we're doing. Is it's all about, we need to do a little bit of education. We need to do a little bit of outreach and have conversations. Because it's only by, facilitating discussion that we overcome these sorts of perceptions or understandings of things.
Yeah, and that was a huge part of the walking audits that we conducted with AARP, Citizens Transportation Coalition, and Urban Paths. We had over 140 volunteers over the course of 4 weekends, and we walked 4 miles. Um, and this was just after Barrel as well, so we took that opportunity to clean up the sidewalks, clean up the bike lanes. And there we had an assessment of crosswalks, bus stops, sidewalks, even the condition of the trees and whether they were uprooting and breaking our sidewalks. And we had all of those volunteers share testimony at the TERS meeting. And even some people changed their minds in support of the project.
Well, I think something you were pointing to also is just how can we imagine other possibilities? If all we're thinking through is, oh, we'll add more lanes and that'll move us quickly. It disregards, again, yes, more cars on the road will eventually just materialize because we've incentivized it, which slows everything down. A bus would take a lot more people and offer an alternative. But, as Casey and I were also chatting about earlier, both of us, I think, were horrified when we learned a particular statistic that is 97% of infrastructural money through TxDOT has to, by state law, go to highways.
By the state constitution.
Yeah, which is, is just very limiting in terms of the potential imagination of alternative projects, which doesn't mean everything has to suddenly turn into Bike-topia or Bus-topia or swim on the Bayou-topia. I don't know, whatever your particular design project is here. But I think most people would agree 97% of money going to one form of infrastructure is really just not advisable. That's a very limiting capacity for what we could potentially do in a myriad of other forms, and also be responsive to different sites that have different needs. Because, I think part of what's interesting about starting a conversation about walkability in Montrose, now I'm listed a really fine piece in the Houston Chronicles op-ed section that I'll shout out, is Montrose, whether or not it actually is the most walkable part of Houston, is culturally recognized as the kind of walkable heart of Houston. And it's a mess. It's just as Alan well points out, many parts of it that would seem like natural, kind of pillars of where you'd want to walk are actually just a mess. And thinking about, okay, what is it for a place that is where people want to go for this kind of inner city vibrancy? What does that really entail and require, and how can we work for this region to give this community what it actually wants?
I gotta tell you, I think it all comes down to building political leadership that is dedicated to that project and building community support to hold leadership accountable and to put these issues on the map. Because, when we're talking about 97% of funding from TxDOT goes directly to roads, that builds sort of institutional momentum. You have to justify why you spend the money the way you do, and suddenly it's all we know, and it's the only way that a lot of folks think. And it makes, it's quite the tailwind to try and fight.
Oh, sorry.
I talk too much.
Well, maybe you could talk a little bit about your theory of change. You're a grassroots organization. This is about building community support, as you said, to put pressure on leaders, or if not put pressure, encourage them. I'm not exactly sure how you conceive it, but maybe it'd be worth talking us through what you imagine for the project and your organization.
Yeah, so I think that there's a couple of components to our theory of change. One is storytelling. We need folks in the area who care a whole lot about this stuff to share what they've experienced. That includes folks at Lake Be-Able sharing how the sidewalks are in such poor condition or too narrow for them to get around. That includes folks that have suffered flooding and lost or suffered unnecessary car expenses from their vehicle getting flooding. That includes cyclists sharing that, this is actually a really valuable path for us. That includes folks like renters who come to this area for because of its reputation, because of the amenities it has. So storytelling, I think, is a huge part of it. And, I love that we should brag about this everywhere we freaking go. We've helped, it was 140 volunteers, 140 plus volunteers for the walk audit, but we've helped 120 people speak at City Hall in support of the project. And like Alondra alluded to earlier, Most of them have done this only just once. This is their first time doing it. That's really, really special. Anything else to add on all that?
Yeah, I think sharing our experiences with, for example, a week without driving or National Pedestrian Safety Month, just having a narrative shift and a cultural shift in Houston for those things, um, and making sure that people know that they're not alone if they do make the choice to be car free, because it can be kind of isolating to move on your own. Every time, I make the trek, to U of H or even to today to the Rice campus, there's no one on the sidewalk besides me. So that's why we started Friends of the Boulevard, so we could gather with our neighbors. And even though there is a lot of infrastructural segregation in Houston, a space that they can share what their vision is and also like what their fears are, and how we can get through it together. I transitioned into being car free because I moved near Spike and we started working together. So we live about we live about 4 minutes away from each other, and we meet up and we bike to work. And that's how I learned how to be safe on the road. That's how I learned what it means to share the road with cars. And I think our place of work and that being a bike friendly business has helped so much. And I think that's a missing component here in Houston as well. Um, they bought me my first commuter bike. They helped me move to Montrose. I was previously living, I've lived in a couple of places, but in Channelview, where the commute was 45 minutes. I've lived by Hobby Airport, where Alameda Genoa is also on the high injury network, where 58% of serious injuries and fatalities happen on 9% of roads. And then I moved to Montrose, where Montrose Boulevard is also on the high injury network. So you kind of, to an extent in Houston, never escape it. But I've learned so much through being in Montrose. And I think we've taken what we've learned and taken something personal, made it into something academic, and now, professional, because we do work for an air quality nonprofit. So it's taken people from that personal experience into advocacy.
I'm glad you bring up the importance of other people being on the road. I'm having flashbacks to Jane Jacobs, great American urbanist, the mid-century, and one of the kind of central findings in her early work on the subject is just that importance of other people around and that sense of safety and security. And I think it's something that anyone, especially folks who lived in other cities where maybe there's a bit more walkability as the norm. But certainly here, if you've walked or if you've biked around, and that feeling of isolation, that feeling of being alone is jarring, and doing things that can remedy that to help build that sociability. Could go into a whole other conversation on third spaces and the importance of community building. But purely as this little anecdotal conversation to some degree demonstrates, I think people in Houston who bike or pedestrians or have lived car free at some point kind of find each other and are, you did this thing too. Okay, that's tremendously exciting because it's not many of us.
I think this is really important because part of what's happening, it's an attempt to redefine what security and safety means. There are some visions of security which are just about adding police to buses or trains or something like that. This is a very different vision of security and safety. That's about sociability, being with people, making sure that everyone feels like they're protected and safe around the people who they're with. And then also a very different vision of mobility, getting us away from the idea that mobility just means single owner car or just owning a car and driving it around. Mobility as a capacity for movement. And you guys are talking about how people with different abilities are negotiating these spaces, and I think it's really important.
And I think Houston really is. We're at the very front of this fight nationally. And we're experiencing that transitional stage, and it goes back and forth all the time. That's just how this sort of stuff is. But like Houston Metro, we here in Houston, we spend some of the lowest per capita on transit, but Houston Metro is able to move a huge number of people with relatively little money. When we build projects, we're rewarded. The red line was on time. Actually, it might have been a little early. It was on budget, and it met its ridership targets way faster than anticipated. And today it's just under, Houston Metro Rail is just under 25% of all light rail systems by ridership per track mile. So we have a smaller system, yeah, but it punches way above its weight.
Well, and I think that's, back to the point of where we're putting 97% of our money, and when we're thinking about what is economically responsible, different kinds of projects, especially well thought out ones in strategic areas, if they're not available because the funding is just so locked in, it doesn't allow for the creativity that a city that is as constantly growing, sprawling, changing, evolving as Houston is. We need that flexibility. We need that ability to be responsive in different communities and say, actually, rather than another lane here, a bus lane would make a huge difference to these folks who are actually mostly busing to work anyway. And so I think that flexibility would be an immense step. We are unfortunately at the end of our time here. Folks want to get involved with Friends of the Boulevard. What should they do?
We actually have a bike ride coming up for National Pedestrian Safety Month on October 20th, and we're meeting at Bell Park, and we're doing it with Pride Ride.
Yeah, and I think another great place to keep up with us, all of our updates and all that, check out Friends of the Boulevard on Instagram. That's our HQ. That's where everything goes up. That's the best way to keep track of what's going on and clue in some way or another. You're not alone. You got to pick this. You got to pick these fights as a crew.
Well, thank you so much. Alex, Spike, Alondra Torres, and my co-host today, Dr. Casey Williams. Thank you all for joining us. I really enjoyed this chat.
Awesome. Thank you so
thanks,
much.
Wes. Thanks, you guys.
A quick shout out that if you'd like to learn more about this topic, you can go back into the Gulfstreams podcast archive. There we have episodes where we've talked about urban design and planning and its impact on the environment with the former director of planning for the city of Houston. We also have a conversation led by our former interns, Jaden and Sienna, where they walk you through the state of urban design and transport across the country. So both of those are really interesting episodes that I'd strongly encourage you, if you have any interest in the subject, go back and take a listen to them because they'll give you a lot more context for our conversation today. We'll now go to our researcher, Jaden, who has a follow-up piece all about the climate impacts of transit, thinking through which forms are best for our environment and which ones are the worst. And she'll share that with you now.
Hey everyone, have you ever wondered what the most sustainable type of transit is? Well, if you have, you're in the right place. Today we'll be taking a look at what modes of transportation would actually be the best for the environment. To start, let's first understand how much of an impact transit has on the environment. In 2023, according to the Rutgers Climate Action Plan, transit alone made up 27% of all CO2 emissions. But out of all types of transit, which one contributed the most to that number? I'll break this up into a couple of sections, starting with planes, then moving on to trains, followed by buses, and then lastly cars, to determine which is the most and least sustainable for our planet. So every mode has to be cleaner than planes, right? And the overwhelming answer is yes. Traveling by air, while likely the most convenient, is the worst for the environment. With the amount of jet fuel needed to keep the plane flying, makes the airline industry one of the most significant contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. For instance, according to a Stanford University News article, for a family to drive 5.5 hours versus taking a 1 hour long flight, you would cut the amount of carbon dioxide used by a third. It's important to note that a lot of factors go into why planes have the largest footprint. Let's take this for example, celebrity private plane usage. Just one element that contributes heavily to this problem. Many take frivolous flights to easily drivable locations, racking up larger carbon footprints in just a few trips than many could contribute in their lifetime. Now that we understand that traveling by air is the worst, we can then ask the question, are there ways to make traveling by plane slightly better for the environment? And the answer is, well, of course. Individuals could ensure that their flight is direct, cutting out any unnecessary or out-of-the-way layovers that could cause more fuel to be used. Additionally, we can collectively promote airlines working to reduce their carbon footprint, like Alaska Airlines and KLM Royal Dutch Airlines. Such corporations are known for their commitment to sustainable aviation fuel and using more fuel-efficient aircrafts. These airlines also have lofty goals of reducing carbon emissions. Other smaller airlines, like Air Baltic, also allow individuals to purchase, quote, more sustainable fuel when purchasing their tickets to help airlines reach their sustainability goals. So now that we know flying is at the bottom, we can only go up from here. So next up is trains. Trains are one of the most sustainable ways to travel due to their energy efficiency, which makes them surprisingly more sustainable than both cars and planes. According to the Federal Railroad Administration, Amtrak's electric trains are 72% less polluting than planes and 83% less polluting than cars. Amtrak is also 46% more energy efficient than driving and 34% more energy efficient than flying. Given the low carbon emissions per passenger mile, especially for electric trains, it is less shocking that trains are ranked as one of the best modes of transportation. Now, here's the caveat. While taking a train is ideal for both short and long distances, it does depend on the infrastructure. And by this I mean, if you take a train from coast to coast, stopping numerous times, it can actually be less efficient than, say, driving a hybrid or all-electric car. While definitely a specific instance, it's important to be aware before purchasing the unlimited hop-on and off railroad passes. Additionally, one of the most sustainable types of trains is the high-speed train. With increasing development globally in places such as China, France, and in states like Utah, California, and Colorado, we may be on our way to a world with cleaner transit. The U.S. High-Speed Rail Association made a similar statement a few years back, stating, "High-speed rail is the single largest climate solution that can decarbonize the majority of our transportation network quickly." Keeping this in mind, despite the increased time it would take for cross-country travel, would you consider taking a train over a plane? Regardless, now that we've covered the worst type of transit, and likely the best, especially now that they have high-speed rail in their back pocket, let's take a look at how sustainable buses are. With the number of passengers a bus can hold being significantly more extensive than that of a standard car, buses tend to be another highly sustainable form of transportation. According to a study done in 2023 by Metro Magazine, from a fuel efficiency standpoint, inner-city buses are 550% more fuel efficient than cars per passenger. Another large factor that makes buses more sustainable than cars is that when individuals take public transportation instead of driving, that act alone reduces CO2 emissions by 45%, as suggested by UCLA Transportation. Furthermore, with fewer cars on the road, buses can actually lead to improved air quality in cities, and that is because buses reduce the amount of gas burned by up to 4.2 billion gallons per year. It is vital to understand that taking a bus will be better than taking a car, though this form of transit varies slightly in different places. For instance, an article by Time Out Travel lists the 19 cities in the world with the best bus systems, and the US doesn't make it onto the list until spot 15, and it's only New York City. Europe and Asia take all the spots before. We should also acknowledge that some countries are doing more to improve their bus systems than others. In Colombia, for instance, in 2023, the UN Environment Program and the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development launched a program with the goal of creating gender-inclusive shift to electric transit, creating jobs for women, and ensuring public transit meets their needs. This initiative spread to 6 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. I'd also like to highlight another one of the major benefits of taking the bus is the low fare prices. While at times airline travel can be affordable in some parts of the world, not that we would know that in Houston, train fares, depending on where your starting and endpoints are generally going to be cheaper than flying or the tolls and gas you would have to pay to drive, making taking the bus the most affordable option, whether it's a quick ride for $2.75 or a more extended trip from, say, Houston to Dallas for $30. That being said, there are some drawbacks, mainly regarding the number of convenient routes offered, especially here in Houston. However, I nonetheless encourage bus transit if possible and urge us to promote our government to make more bus routes efficient and reliable. So bearing all this in mind, let's take a look at how cars would rank on the scale. Houston, I'm sorry to say it, but traveling by car is one of the most significant contributors to climate change. Not only is driving a leading contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and subsequently a leader in compromising our air quality, but the infrastructure required for cars can also have devastating consequences for the environment. A concept we know all too well here in Texas is urban sprawl. According to National Geography, we can have severe impacts on the land ecosystems and wildlife. Outside of how cars can lead to harmful air quality levels, the ways in which the production of gasoline and diesel from crude oil involves environmentally damaging processes such as drilling and refining, which can result in oil spills, habitat destruction, and further air and water pollution. Additionally, cars require vast amounts of raw minerals, including metals like steel and aluminum, as well as other rare earth elements for electric vehicles. The mining process and these minerals can lead to deforestation, biodiversity loss, and contamination of water sources, and many of these elements are not sustainably sourced. The most significant factor, though, may be the sheer amount of energy needed and consumed. In today's world, many assume that if everyone got rid of a diesel truck and got an electric car, we'd be in a much better environmental position. However, that is not necessarily true, as even electric vehicles can have environmental impacts depending on the source of electricity used to charge them. If the electricity comes from coal or natural gas, it can still lead to significant emissions, in addition to the very real possibility that our grid simply could not sustain that drastic shift. Cars have been and will continue to cause major environmental issues due to the sheer volume of cars driven every single day around the world. While there is no true one-size-fits-all solution, Lewis and Clark Law School proposed that we should ban the sale of new internal combustion engine vehicles, which may help reduce some of the climate problems that we attribute to cars. Additionally, we can carpool. There's a reason why HOV lanes are still active. Speed up your travel time by doing good for the environment and stop taking so many solo trips. While it's safe to say flying is still the worst type of transit, driving is still certainly far from the top. In essence, while all forms of transportation have some impact on the environment, some are significantly worse than others. Air travel is the most harmful due to high fuel consumption and emission, but there are ways to mitigate its impacts through better choices like flying direct and supporting eco-conscious airlines. On the other end, trains, particularly high-speed and electric trains, offer a far more sustainable option. Buses are also an eco-friendly choice, especially in urban areas where they reduce the overall emissions and fuel use. Cars, especially those running on fossil fuels, are major contributors to climate change, but carpooling and hybrid vehicles can help lessen the environmental damage. Ultimately, the best transit solution depends on the infrastructure available and making informed choices to reduce our collective carbon footprint.
Next, we have a new segment that will be a recurring segment over the coming weeks from our researcher Sophia, where she'll take you into the expansive wildlife of Houston and talk with local conservationists all about their favorite examples of local flora and fauna. It's called Critter Corner, and here's Sophia.
Hi everyone, my name is Sophia, and welcome to Critter Corner, where we will explore the fascinating wildlife in the Houston area. In each episode of this series, we bring on wildlife experts and nature enthusiasts to share stories of their favorite local animals, explore why these species are important to our ecosystems, and discuss ways that all of us can help to support the diverse wildlife in our community. For the first episode of Critter Corner, we will be talking to Suzanne Simpson, one of the authors of Wild Houston, explore the amazing nature in and around the Bayou City. Welcome to the show, Suzanne. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Sophia.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you for coming on. So, we're here to discuss your favorite animal in the Houston area. Can you tell us what animal you'll be talking about today and why it's special to you?
Today, I'm going to be talking about the alligator snapping turtle. It's special to me for a lot of reasons, but I think it really exemplifies what nature in Houston is all about, because this is North America's largest freshwater turtle, and we didn't realize that it had a really robust population within the city of Houston until about a decade ago. So it just shows that if you keep exploring in this area, you're going to find new things.
That's super interesting. I definitely saw those a lot when I was a kid when I would play around the bayou. So I'd love to hear more about the alligator snapping turtle. So let's dive deeper. What role does it play in Houston's ecosystem, as far as we know?
Alligator snapping turtles are pretty much an apex predator in the areas that they occupy. That means they're at the top of the food chain. So they're going to be ambush predators that are picking off fish and other freshwater creatures by using their tongue as a lure. They have this pink flesh on the end of their tongue, and they wriggle it. And so they're attracting these predators into their jaws, and they'll pretty much eat whatever they can catch. It's important that we have these predators on the top of the food chain, because over time, we've lost a lot of our apex predators through our own actions. So it's great that we've discovered this within Buffalo Bayou, that we have this top of the food chain predator that's there to control populations, to keep everything in balance. They're really important creatures for that reason.
Well, it's great to hear that this apex predator is keeping things balanced in the Buffalo Bayou, and I will definitely be staying out of its way. But now I'm curious. what is one surprising fact about the species that people might not know?
Boy, there's so much we don't know about the alligator snapping turtle that it's difficult to hone in on one. Now, I'll note that the most surprising fact about it in our area is that A, it exists, but B, our populations here in the city of Houston are among the healthiest that have been discovered throughout. So even, rural brown water bayous in Florida, our turtles are large. They have actually a variety of different sizes, which is really good to know whenever you're studying a species that you have young adults, and then you have the adults that have been there for a long time. So it's great to have that kind of scale. And that they also have fewer battle wounds on their shells. So that indicates that they're able to have enough space to maintain these populations. They're not fighting over territory quite as much as we see in other areas where they occupy. So the fun fact is that not only are these turtles here, but they're actually doing a lot better than you would think.
Oh, that's great to hear that it's doing well, as it's so important to the ecosystem. For those who would still like to get involved, what are some simple ways that people can support the alligator snapping turtle?
Yeah, a great way to support them is to support the organizations that protect their habitat and protect their populations. So the Turtle Survival Alliance has really spearheaded a lot of the research on the alligator snapping turtle. They're a great organization to support. And also the turtle was discovered in our most urban waterways. So supporting organizations like Buffalo Bayou Partnership that helps to make Buffalo Bayou a great place to be, that's another awesome way to connect yourself to the alligator snapping turtle and its conservation.
Great. Well, Suzanne, thank you so much for sharing those tips, and thank you for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure to learning about the alligator snapping turtle and how important it is to local ecosystems. And for everyone listening, make sure to check out Suzanne's book, Wild Houston, if you are interested in learning more about Houston wildlife. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Suzanne.
My pleasure. Stay snappy.
Planning on it. That goes out to all y'all in the audience too. And we will be back soon with another episode of Critter Corner. Thank you so much for listening.
Finally, our researcher Numan will tell you all about what you can do to get involved in Houston and make the environment a better place this week.
Hi everyone! As we embrace the fall season, it's the perfect time to connect with our community. Whether you're interested in wellness or volunteering, there are many exciting events coming up. Starting this Wednesday, October 16th, you can go on a wellness walk at Buffalo Bayou. Anyone and everyone is invited to walk through the paths of Buffalo Bayou Park while discussing topics including mental and physical health as well as the benefits of being exposed to nature. This relaxing and reconnecting walk will depart at 6:30 and covers 3 miles in 1.5 hours. Then, this Saturday, October 19th, you can join the monthly bird banding program at the Gulf Coast Bird Observatory headquarters in Lake Jackson from 8 a.m. to 12 p.m. Research associates will be capturing birds to weigh, measure, and record vital information such as species, sex, and age. This project provides important information about bird migratory patterns, longevity, and the physical conditions of the birds. The purpose of this program is to establish baseline data and obtain information about the physical conditions of these migrating birds. Alternatively, you can also volunteer at Buffalo Bayou Park for the community-wide Volunteer Day occurring on the third Saturday of each month. Everyone aged 9 and up are invited to volunteer, whether as individual or a group effort. Individuals can register by completing the online waiver at buffalobayou.org, and if you'd like to gather a small group, groups can reserve spaces by emailing volunteer@buffalobayou.org. Volunteers' tasks include but are not limited to trash pickup, mulching, and weed removal. If you'd like to volunteer, be sure to bring your own work gloves, but all other necessary work tools will be provided. To sign up, visit buffalobayou.org to read the volunteer information packet and complete an online volunteer waiver. So, whether you join the wellness walk, help with bird banding, or volunteer at Buffalo Bayou, there's something for everyone. Stay tuned for next week's episode for more ways to get involved and make a difference. Until then, take care.
Up next time on Gulf Streams, we'll be talking about the state of environmental education. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email us at westont@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Co-produced by Joseph Campana. Audio engineer Rico Enriquez. Research support provided by Neman Rensdorf, Jaden Bray-Boyce, and Sophia Soltes. Stay tuned for the R&R Show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.